And just waiting for the confirmation and then we'll get going. Everything is a little more complicated these days, isn't it?
At least you know how to navigate it.
I
It's
try.
going to be part of a resume to get a job in a historical society.
For sure. All righty. We are now streaming live on Facebook, so we are going to get started. Thank you, everyone, for joining us today for our conversation with Gary Shattuck and Nick Muller, who are two of the three authors of the newest publication from the Vermont Historical Society. I want to give you a couple of quick logistical pieces today, and that is that I am muting and turning off the video for everyone who has joined us on this call today. If you would like to address a question to the authors, you can do so using the Zoom chat. I also want you to know that this presentation is being recorded and it's also being live streamed to Facebook. So if the idea of your words and yourself being recorded on the internet makes you uncomfortable, please just know that. You can always address a question or comment to us through another venue. The best way to address questions and comments to myself or to our other two speakers will be using the chat function of the Zoom or the comments on the Facebook Live post. I can't promise we will address every single question because I expect us to have a lively conversation today, but I will be monitoring both of those places and posing those questions and comments to our two authors today so that they can respond to them. So if you are not familiar with using that chat function, move your mouse around a little bit. There will be a chat button that appears. Click on that and then you can type in a message, and I have that called up and I'm keeping an eye on it. So please do make sure to give us a heads up if you have any questions or comments that you want to address today. Okay. With that, it is my sincere pleasure to begin our conversation today on, as I said, the newest publication of the Vermont Historical Society. This book called The Rebel and the Tory. I don't have a copy at hand. Nick, you had a copy of the cover that you held up just a moment ago for us. There it is, The Rebel and the Tory, Ethan Allen, Philip Skene, and the Dawn of Vermont. We are delighted to have our two of our three authors with us here today, especially at this moment. Next weekend is the 250th anniversary of the central event of this book, the ejectment trials, which we will learn and hear a little bit more about today. They're an important moment in early Vermont history, and it's kind of fun that this is all happening, and we're sharing this with you today, just around almost exactly 250 years later. It really points to how timely our conversation is today. So if you are not yet familiar with The Rebel and the Tory, it was published this spring by the Vermont Historical Societies. It's been getting phenomenal reviews. I think our authors are very pleased, as they should be, and we're pleased at the Vermont Historical Society to see it getting such great reviews by historians and scholars. The Journal of the American Revolution, who know what they're talking about, to say the very least, gave it a 10 out of 10 in their recent review of the book. So this has become very quickly a must-read for early Vermont history. So we have as I mentioned, two of the three authors with us today. Our third author, John Duffy, unfortunately passed away and before the book was published, but his spirit and his scholarship, I would say, are very much with us in this book. But I did want to make sure that we mentioned him as we talk about the book today, and he has been an integral part of other Vermont Historical Society publications as well. So The Rebel and the Tory is a close examination of sources surrounding some of the most storied moments in the founding of Vermont. It uses sources that were previously well known, but it also uses brand new sources that were rediscovered, sources that were untouched by pretty much anyone since the people that they wrote them, to craft what I've been thinking of as a really meticulous and careful narrative. And it really reframes the way we think about this moment in early Vermont history. It's particularly exciting that our two authors today were able to find and access these primary sources and archival documents as part of their work, and really bring, it's always exciting when you find a new source, a new American source from this time period, because there just doesn't feel like there's that many of them left to discover. So being able to discover a new one is a particularly great moment. So today joining us, we have our two authors, Gary Shattuck and Nick Muller, and we're going to have a conversation about their work today and touch on some of the topics that come up in the book, some of their research work to get to those topics in the first place. And I'm excited to see where our conversation goes. We are still getting some people adding in the chat, so I'm trying to do that. As a reminder, if you're coming to us newly, you will be muted and have your video turned off, just as a heads up. And the best way to ask questions is in the chat. So I would be remiss if I did not also remind you, if you leave this meeting today and you desperately want to read the whole story, you should. The book is now for sale through the Vermont Historical Society's bookstore, and I am putting a link in the chat at this moment for you to click on and get your very own copy. Shipping is a little bit delayed right now, but it will ship. We're sort of staffing the museum periodically where the books are living right now. So that was a very long introduction, but I wanted to make sure that I framed everything out for you as we start our conversation today. Nick and Gary, thank you both so much for joining us in our conversation today and for talking about your book. Congratulations on the book, first of all.
Thank you.
Thank you, Amanda.
Great. So what we're going to do today is have a conversation that hopefully whets everyone's interest to go out and read the book. And I want to start by posing my first question, which is one of the two gentlemen whose name is in the title of the book, Philip Skene. I want to start with him because I think one of the best things that your book does is restore him to his rightful central place in this story and in this moment in Vermont. So could you tell everyone, explain to us who was Philip Skene and why is he important to the story of Vermont?
Gary,
Nick,
you want to start that?
Go.
Philip Skene came to the Champlain Valley in 1758 and fought with the British in that disaster at Fort Ticonderoga, where Montcalm beat their socks in pretty badly. Skene was hurt, but he impressed the higher brass. He was a captain at that time. He made a career out of being a soldier. And the next year in 1759, when Amherst took Fort Ticonderoga and began his travel down the lake to Montreal, he left Skene behind as the major of the regiment. And he was tasked with restoring, to the extent possible, Forts Ticonderoga and the fort at Crown Point, and making sure the Crown Point road from Charleston, New Hampshire to Crown Point, or at least to the Vermont shore of the lake opposite Crown Point, Chimney Point, was completed. Skene fell in love with the land. I had been connected with Fort Ticonderoga for a long while. I knew that there was a collection of Skein papers there. And I couldn't really understand why Skene virtually didn't appear in any serious role in Vermont history. And really there wasn't much in New York history. I wanted to go and meet Gary there and start going through the papers. Gary told me to stay home. I said, what? He said, you're going to be there and you're going to bring your pencil and you're going to bring your cards and you're going to write what you read, and you'll make mistakes when you write it and you won't necessarily know what's important.
Oops.
I'm going to go there with my digital camera. I'm going to photograph the whole thing. And I also found out that they had already put them online. And so Gary had everything, and that just led him other places. I guess
Great.
I've driven him away.
Gary, we do still have you. If you think that we've lost you, we do still have you.
Okay, yeah, my computer was telling me otherwise, but okay, go ahead.
Nope, we can still see you just fine.
So
Sorry,
that
Nick.
Gary really got into Skene and found things that nobody had really suspected.
Gary, I wonder if you could give us an example of one of those things that you found that no one had expected to figure out about Skene or learn about Skene.
Yeah, this story started out with Nick posing the issue of why hasn't anybody studied skiing, and through Nick's connections at the fort, we got the digitized records that were sent over, and I went through them and was able to piece together the chronology of. I tried to do things chronologically and looked at what was going on with his life, and found that he found out more about his military career, about his connection with another Lieutenant John Small, who's also a central player in this whole thing and shows up in the ejectment trials, because Small was one of the officers that helped create the Crown Point Road. So these men were all closely tied together back in 1759. And then Amherst had a proposal to create a new barrier colony using this land that went between the Connecticut River and Lake Ontario. And there was a proposal put forward by Skene and 6 other New England colonels to see if they could get land taken out of New York's possession and granted to themselves so that they could create this barrier colony to stop the invasions from coming down from up north. But as we know, Wolfe was successful in Quebec, and Amherst and the rest of the British military were successful in the 7 Years' War, and eventually that plan for the new colony went away.
Great. So we'll get into
But
sort of what
only went away temporarily.
Temporarily.
Yeah.
But then keep in mind, there's 3 phases in this thing. There's a pre-ejectment trial situation involving the creation of the colony, which gets put on hold. There's the ejectment trials, and then we have the situation after the ejectment trials when this plan is revived again, and that's kind of the chronology. And we've got Skene as a steady player throughout those 3 phases. Between 1759 and 1775, we're talking a 16-year period is what this book covers.
Great. Why do you think previous historians have overlooked Skene's role in all 3 of these phases?
I'll take a first swat at that, and then Gary can come in. Skene had, in his last episode, was being involved in the Battle of Bennington, not as a military person, but as an individual sent by Burgoyne to go over and get the Vermont towns to understand that they either claimed that they would be loyal to the crown or they would be killed. And Skene was regarded thereafter as an arch Tory, number 1. Number 2, he was a loser. And the winners write the history, not the losers. And so he was the largest landholder in the Champlain Valley, including some of Vermont. And he was close to a number of Vermont leaders, particularly west of the Green Mountains. But he never, they ignored him. The other kind of thing too is if you were a 19th century Vermont historian and you wanted to study Skene, most of his papers were at that point in England or France. His granddaughter had the ones that were in France. The rest were parts of the British governmental records. So it was a long voyage. You weren't going to fly over there. And it was expensive. And they didn't think he mattered. Do you want to pound in on that, Gary?
Yeah, is there anything you'd like to add, Gary?
No, I agree.
That covers it. Well, it's funny you say that, Nick, that there's that saying that history is written by the victors. I've been thinking about that a lot lately and thinking that maybe there's a corollary that history is also written by the verbose, which I think is a...
Excellent.
Those both tie very closely to Winston Churchill.
Well, I was thinking that it also brings us to the other gentleman in the title of your book, Ethan Allen. So I wonder if you could now bring in that part of the story and talk a little bit about how Ethan and his brother Ira's early writings influenced sort of later generations' perceptions of everything that happened at this moment in early Vermont.
Ethan was when the Yorkers that had owned land or thought they owned land in what are the grants began to consider ejectment suits. Ethan was hired by the proprietors. I think everybody probably in the call knows that when Wentworth made his grants, he didn't grant them to settlers. He granted them to proprietors for each town. The proprietors would have large pieces of land in a town and expect to make money by selling it to settlers. And the proprietors met in Massachusetts because they understood if the Yorkers won these trials, their speculations were gone. And they hired Ethan to manage it for them. And that's where Gary really got, we asked the question of where the court records were, because this has been a central point, an inflection point in Vermont history. The way it's told is the ejectment trials lost because the courts were corrupt, because they're aristocratic, whatever the colonial would be a nobleman, and the poor, humble grants settlers didn't have a chance. It turns out the story is very different. And one more before I get the reason Gary really is involved in this book to start with. I found the papers, not like I was rooting for them or anything. I knew who to turn to, and that suddenly they had been virtually sitting untouched in New York City since the colonial years. They were on the 7th and 8th floor of the Surrogates Courthouse on Chambers Street, New York. And they were found, and the archivists were moving them in January of 2017 to Albany. And my inquiry was made in March of 2017. And I found them, and they made a few copies. These are on scrolls, largely. And they made a copy of Small. Gary mentioned Major John Small versus Carpenter, the Grants settler. And the case was not Small versus Carpenter. It was Peter Quiet. And then there were a bunch of other things. It was always Peter Quiet doing the suing. And I thought, these Yorkers were worse than I ever dreamed. They were hiding behind aliases. Happily, I copied the archivist in Albany when I sent all this stuff to John Duffy, who was in Florida. And we did telephonic high fives and fist bumps. And we really had them until the archivist told me that Dr. Muller, you don't know how to read them. Oh, he saved me a lot of embarrassment. But right then, I asked John. John said yes. And we turned to Gary, who has a distinguished legal career after his 12 years serving as a Vermont state trooper. He was assistant AG, a U.S. attorney from Vermont, assistant U.S. attorney. Yeah. And he could do things with these records that I simply couldn't. He understood all the little Latin phrases that I didn't. He understood the difference between a chancery court and another kind of court. And I think it's time for Gary to talk.
Yeah, I would love for Gary to tell us more about this research, and in particular, was there anything that surprised you because you're doing research?
It was a tremendous surprise and a great privilege to be able to look at these records. To get back to where you were asking about Ethan's involvement and what his contribution was to the perceptions of what was going on at this time period. I mean, anybody that's a student of the time knows about his brief narrative of hundreds of pages that condemns the Yorkers. And I was working on a master's thesis and went into researching the Vermont Constitution with that understanding that why would anybody question Ethan? And he was talking about how bad the courts were. And so I started to look at the court records that are at the Vermont State Archives in Cumberland County and Gloucester County over along the Connecticut River. And I just wasn't seeing proof of these ejectment trials that Ethan said were coming fast and furiously. And so I began to question at that point what was going on. But I continued with the thesis and without answering my questions. So when Nick called to ask if I wanted to get involved with the Supreme Court records, because I was only dealing with county court records, courts of common pleas, courts of general sessions. But having the opportunity to get involved with the New York Supreme Court of Judicators records, that was a great privilege. And so between Nick speaking with the New York Archives and getting the Supreme Court records there, I went over and saw Jim Foltz in Albany. And it wasn't 30 seconds after he showed me what he had from the Supreme Court that I knew we had an explosive story here, that Ethan was full of baloney in the way he was recounting what happened. There were not 6 ejectment trials that they complained of. There were 18 of them, listed all their different names. People were coming and going at times that just were not consistent with Ethan's account. So I did a lot more research into the subject of ejectment trials to find out what this was all about. Were settlers being ejected? Was there truth to what Ethan was saying? And I could not find that any of it was truthful, frankly. It was a lot of propaganda that Ethan was saying. So one, there were no ejectments. The court was not, and the prosecuting attorneys were, or plaintiff's attorneys were not dressed in splendor alone, because the defense attorneys were doing it also, because if they all didn't do it, they were held in contempt by the court. There were issues about appeals that Ethan said were not available to the poor settlers. That's not true. Appeals were available. There were just a number of things. We cover them in the book. But I think the main point about this concept of ejectment trials and people being ejected from the grants because of the nefarious Yorkers is a misnomer. Ejectment didn't mean that they were necessarily thrown off the land. An ejectment trial was a way to establish title to land. We had 2 conflicting land ownership concepts. We had the New England fee simple issues governed by primogeniture, and we had the New York practice of patents being issued to landlords. So we had 2 conflicting ways of looking at land. But we had the commonality of ejectment trials, which had a centuries-long tradition in the colonies, reaching back to Edward, King Edward. They were revised at the time of Cromwell, and they were very accepted in the colonies. Even in New York, even in New England, the colonists knew what ejectment meant. It was efficient, it was liked, they welcomed it. Alexander Hamilton specifically wrote about it and talked about how good it was. So it was a good process that got perverted over 200 years of being condemned by attorneys or historians that never looked at the records. So an ejectment trial, I don't need to go on about this. An ejectment trial is a way to establish title. And if a plaintiff proved the 4 elements of an ejectment, I don't need to get into it, we do it in the book. But if he proved those 4 elements and a jury found in his favor, he had a title. He had a legally recognized title. That didn't mean an ejectment happened. He didn't have to enforce that finding. He could go out and negotiate with a squatter or a trespasser or a tenant and say, I have a court recognized title. How do you want to deal with me in this ownership issue? And a lot of those were negotiated. Those that were not negotiated, that person could take this jury finding, go to the court and get a writ from the court that is issued to the sheriff, ordering the sheriff to go out and seize this land and make sure there's nobody on it and to turn it over to the plaintiff. So that's what an ejectment trial was. And there were other issues going on there about, at the very same time, that Kemp and Duane filed these lawsuits, there were issues having to do with tax collection, the quit rents under New York law, which resulted in orders for partition of certain patents to happen. And it was that which brought surveyors into the New Hampshire grants, into the Bennington area, to partition this land. And they were doing that right at the same time that the Duane and Kemp filed these complaints in the court in order to get a clarification on title. So it's a complicated legal issue there, and it's not as cut and dry as Ethan and company tried to make it.
Ethan, every one of the ejectment trials, the plaintiffs won. And Ethan was supposed to manage the trials for the defendants. And he did that ineptly. He brought things to court that could not be admitted to court because they were not what they called testified. That means notarized, that they were real documents. And much of his 1774 brief narrative was basically a defense of himself.
Amanda, you asked what was one of the interesting things to find out in these court records, and I think a new thing that strikes directly at Ethan that has never been disclosed before is his own attorney saying that they acted out of ignorance. And the background of this is that Peter Sylvester, a New York attorney, instructed Ethan or the proprietors to go to New Hampshire and get these records and make sure that they cross the T's, dot the I's in order for them to be admissible evidence. When Ethan brought these papers back to the trial in Albany in June of 1770 and showed them to Sylvester and a Connecticut attorney, Jared Ingersoll, who was assisting them, they must have been astounded to see how inept they were. Because, and we have the actual records from John Tabor Kemp, who represented the plaintiffs, and we can see his handwriting, and he talks about Sylvester's trying to get them introduced, and then when he gets called on the fact that they don't meet the rules for admissibility in a court proceeding, Sylvester stands up and says, these were, the reason it is not good evidence is because of ignorance. And we know from Duane's further explanation that ignorance was because of Ethan Allen's failure to abide by the instructions that were given to him by Sylvester when he was told to go to New Hampshire. So that was a very interesting piece of this, to see his own attorney saying, we have evidence of, Ethan's ignorance that contributed to the losses.
So Ethan wrote that brief narrative in 1774. And after he was captured by the British and came back to Vermont, it was Vermont by then, in 1779, he published, help me with the title. When he republished the brief narrative with a different title.
So Vindication?
Yeah. He published the Vindication, which was 200 and some pages, and most of it was the same identical prose as was in the brief narrative. That stood, and in Ira Allen in 1798, sanitized it a little, but published pretty well Ethan's point of view in his history of the state of Vermont, natural and political history of the state. Those two documents really stood until Jared Sparks, the first person in America to hold a professorship to teach in American history at Harvard. He eventually became president of Harvard College, and he was stimulated by Henry Stevens, a Vermont tavern owner or inn owner who had made done a lot of work in assembling early Vermont documents. And he assembled a lot of documents for Sparks, which Sparks had used, for example, in his work on Parkman. And Parkman wrote about what was happening on Lake George. He wrote the volumes on Montcalm and Wolfe. He convinced Sparks to write a biography of Ethan Allen, published in 1833. And that was the first time that this story sort of developed. And it caught on. And virtually every biographer of Allen or historian from that day to this has followed, essentially asserted that the losses in the ejectment trials were so devastating and so corrupt that when Allen came back to Bennington, and they had a meeting at Bennington in the church, but also there were, men from other towns at that meeting. It wasn't simply Benningtonites. That's when they formed the Green Mountain Boys. And the Green Mountain Boys essentially made it their objective, which was to make New York unable to assert its authority in the land that the Orders in Council of 1764 had indicated actually was New York.
So that encapsulates his. I, for one, am shocked to hear that he may have mischaracterized his own role in this moment. Let me put it that way.
Well, he had to, because he didn't look very good on. Yeah, James Twain, in a year before Allen's brief narrative, had published a book about this, and it's very even-handed, but it's not very good for Allen. For example, after the first trials, Duane and Kemp met with Allen in a tavern or wherever he stayed in Albany. It's not clear whether they did it right after the trial or the next day. Both versions are out there. And they essentially wanted to hire Allen to go back to the Grants and make accommodation with the Grant settlers, with the New York landlords. And Allen said he would do it. And they gave him a horse, or loaned him a horse. And he went to Bennington. And when he returned on July 4th to meet with them again, he told them that he could not. He had tried. And that was when the Green Mountain Boys were formed.
So I have a follow-up question from the chat that I think will be best addressed to Gary. Gary, you mentioned that there have been a number of really basic mistakes made in bringing the documents to the trial and things like that, and Allen's understanding of the way the trials went. So we have a question in the chat: if the papers from New Hampshire had been properly notarized, found admissible by the court, do you think that some of these cases were winnable by the settlers? Do you think it was entirely ineptitude that led to them being found incorrect?
Excellent point. Excellent point. And the answer, yes, I think very much that the New Yorker case could have been compromised. We know from Kemp's records, we know that he and Duane were distressed and very uncertain how this thing was going to unfold.
I'm going to.
And
Is that thing for me?
Okay.
they were uncertain how this thing was going to unfold. And there's a whole list, a laundry list of things that Kemp listed that he thought that he and Duane needed to deal with in the event these papers were admitted. The standard for the level of admissibility of papers was very low. It wouldn't have taken much to get these papers in, but for various reasons we describe it in the book, they were not. But had he gotten it in, Kemp and Duane would have been thrown back and forced to prove a number of different things to counter those records. Had he gotten those records in, the jury would have been able to hear of them and potentially rule by nullification in favor against the New Yorkers to nullify their claims and in favor of the New Hampshire claimants. The
The nullification was not unusual.
No, it was, I mean, John Adams, Jefferson talked about the responsibility of a jury to nullify things that it did not agree with. These juries were unbiased. The two attorneys, the Duane and Kemp, went through what was called a struck jury process, where they met with the justice or with the clerk of the court, and they had something like 48 names of people from Albany and the surrounding communities of Albany, and they could go through and they could strike a certain number of them. And if they didn't do it, then the clerk did it. Benjamin Kasane is a New York City attorney who represented the Grants settlers. He appeared before the court to do this struck jury process, but he refused to do it because he didn't have instructions from his clients. Kasane shows up a number of times. It's just striking to read these records and see the hoops that Duane and Kemp and even the defense attorneys went through to make sure that they complied with appropriate law, because they knew that they could get this thing thrown back at them. Albany juries were not happy with landlords. They had done it in the past and would do it again and slammed their claims against tenants. These juries were made up of farmers, and so they had no love lost for the tenants. There's another line here that goes on that needs to be remembered, is the impact of the Hudson River and the 20-mile line that's to the east of that, which constitutes the western border of Connecticut, goes up to Massachusetts, and then extends north towards Bennington. That was a very potent line where disputes started earlier down in the south along Long Island Sound, and they moved north like a lit fuse. They went up through Connecticut. Then they started to have the violence in Massachusetts, the famous 1766 riots at Nobletown, at which Ethan no doubt knew about, which involved British troops coming in to expel Massachusetts settlers. 3 years later, we have the confrontation at Brackenridge Farm, just north of Nobletown. So Brackenridge and the Vermont situation did not sit in isolation. This was a piece of a long line of contests that moved north to Bennington and then ended up having a court trial in Albany, which, by the way, you have, excuse me, you have to do it. The trial has to take place in the county where the land is located, and that's why the court held the trial in Albany and not down in New York City, despite what Alan and the others said about them having to travel to take care of the case. It, by law, was required to be in Albany. It was going to be right across the river from the Bennington settlers. Nick, do you want to talk about Jared Ingersoll and the his importance as a border commissioner and the alternatives there?
Well, you're the one that got into the Ingersoll papers. John Duffy, when he was still computing, and I had that's how this whole thing started. He called me and said, how do we know Jared Ingersoll took a role in these trials? And I made the stupid statement, well, we get the trial records and study them.
The reason John asked that question is because Highland Hall, for the first time in 1868 in its history of Vermont, said the attorney was Jared Ingersoll.
First time his name was ever mentioned.
But Ethan's, it wasn't Ethan, it was Duane, I believe, said
Duane
that.
calls him Mr. Ingersoll.
Yeah, the eminent counsel Ingersoll from Connecticut. So we set off on this quest to find out who was this Ingersoll. Was it Jared, as Highland Hall said? And by a process of elimination, it turns out it was Jared. It wasn't a cousin David Ingersoll. It wasn't his son. It wasn't a nephew, who were all attorneys. It was Jared without a doubt. And Jared was the eminent counsel that appeared in Albany, because there's another thing going on here we don't need to get into a lot of detail about, but there was an alternative way to deal with border problems, and that was through border commissions. On the very same day that the king and council issued its famous ruling that made the western
Connecticut River, yeah.
the western shore of the Connecticut River the eastern boundary of New York. That same day, historians have not included the fact that he also ordered the creation of a boundary commission to deal with the New Jersey, New York situation, and threw it back to the colonies to deal with it, to appoint people. And that's where Jared Ingersoll came on. You have to ask yourself, why was the Crown and council so irritated with Wentworth that they did not allow him to have a border commission? Why was there a peaceful border commission allowed down in New York and New Jersey on the very same day? And on that same day, they voided over a dozen of Wentworth's laws. What seems happened is they were so irritated with the Wentworth's actions intruding onto New York, they had it placed by fiat, a draconian resolution on him that took away the possibility of a border commission, which in turn forced the settlers and Duane and Kemp to go to a court of law. So we've got equity in chancery courts, we've got law in courts such as the one that Ethan and company found themselves on. There were two alternative ways of dispute resolution in the cases of titles. And so Jared Ingersoll was appointed a part of that, and he was requested by settlers in Nobletown to come to Albany to represent them on the very same day Ethan was going to be there for his ejectment trials. So we've got those two things going. We have a third situation which never been disclosed that jumped right out of the New York records. That same day, Chief Justice, or he wasn't Chief Justice, he was a justice, Robert Livingston was a defendant in an ejectment trial. Robert Livingston was a defendant the very same day. It forced him to leave, to step down off the bench and allow his co-judge to hear the situation. So Livingston was a defendant. We had the Nobletown defendants. We had the Grants defendants. You've never heard this in the histories before, all appearing in the same court on the same day in the same town. And it was just an amazing situation. For what it's worth, Livingston ended up not winning his case, and we talk about it in the book. So if everything was so slanted against the Grant settlers, how did a Supreme Court judge not escape any problem?
Exactly.
And then Nobletown, we don't have a record that that was resolved, but we know that Ingersoll was there because that's the following day he signed a notice to local attorneys for them to, in a way, to deal with their own particular cases. So it was just a very amazing situation to find all of these things concentrating in one courtroom at the same time.
It wasn't clear, was it, Gary, that the historians of Vermont had never really dealt with the fact that the Supreme Court, New York Supreme Court, moved from county to county.
Right, right. They had an obligation under the law to go on to travel from county to county to make appearances there. But this trial would have happened in Albany anyway, because the Grants lands were in the county of Albany.
And the Supreme Court had to deal with these kinds of trials.
Correct. Well, they had concurrent jurisdiction with the Court of Common Pleas, and so it really didn't matter if it was a Court of Common Pleas or the Supreme Court. One of the courts in Albany would have handled it.
Now everybody on this call understands why Mr. Shattuck is an important part of this book.
Yeah, you're flipping right through. I'm even more impressed than I was reading the book, quite frankly. I want to bring in just a couple of comments quickly. First, I want to emphasize and highlight for those who are watching this and have yet to read the book that something Gary mentioned a little earlier, in my opinion, is one of the things that I took away from the book the most, which is placing this moment in Vermont history in the context of everything that was happening up and down what Gary described as that 20-mile line and border disputes in Massachusetts and in New Jersey. So giving some, when we were chatting about this earlier, Gary mentioned that a lot of Vermont historians tend to focus on just the Vermont moment in the story, when to really understand it better, you have to look at everything. I also want to bring in a comment and a question from people who are watching the chats. One of the comments is that Benning Wentworth had a stake in the outcome of this trial, and that he is surprised that those in Portsmouth didn't work to support and provide the appropriate documentation for the trial.
Benning Wentworth was no longer governor. It was his nephew, John Wentworth,
Mm-hmm.
who was playing a different game. He did have a stake, but not the Benning Wentworth stake.
Got it. I should say that our commenter, I added the Benning, and our commenter just said Wentworth, so he may have been referring to the appropriate Wentworth. And we have a question to follow up with for Nick, which is a question of how the Skein papers got to Fort Ticonderoga. Where did they come from, and when did they get there?
There is an appendix in the book that really discusses that. We entitled that the Skein Paperchase. But basically, when Stephen Pell had started to repair, with his wife, bring back the fort. And they lived in a pavilion building, which is going to reopen this year, totally rehabbed. He started to collect, he was a collector, and he started to collect anything it had to do with Ticonderoga. And he knew Skene was there in 1758, 1759, knew that the British had made him more or less commander of those two forts. And he discovered from a Paris newspaper that there was his Skene's granddaughter, who was ancient by then, held a number of Skein papers and was offering them for sale. Now, how he found that thing from the Paris paper, we don't know. But we do know that he went to France, just in a little town just south of Pas-de-Calais, and dealt with this woman and purchased everything she had, which is the basis of the Ticonderoga collection. Second, they came back and he kept a correspondence with the person. She couldn't write by that time legibly, and she had somebody writing for her. He kept in touch with that person, bought some other things that had to do with Skene. In 1969, a batch of Skein papers was offered to the Henry Ford Museum, and they purchased them with the provision that they weren't allowed ever to reveal from whom they purchased them. And those went on auction at Christie's just at the turn of this century. And the then director of Fort Ticonderoga found out about that and did what he called basically a private deal. They bought the papers from Henry Ford at a price that Ford agreed to, but they also had to pay the Christie commission. So there's another 70 or 80 documents came together there. Then there are other documents with Skene that I mentioned earlier that are essentially part of the British governmental records, and somebody would have to go there to find them. There is one small biography of Skene by a woman named Doris Berger. Morton. I could turn around and pick the book off the shelf. But she was the historian at Whitehall, which had been Skenesborough. And it was coming up on the bicentennial of Whitehall. And she essentially was writing for that purpose. So she didn't pay attention really to the third arm of Gary's trilogy here, the third colony, that Skene was made lieutenant governor of a new colony. And there was none of that in there. She wasn't interested in the grants. Ethan Allen doesn't really appear in that book, even though Ethan Allen and Philip Skene hung out together. Allen apparently liked to come to Skene's manor house and be treated well. even though he was Gary, 14 years younger. But he really liked Skene. So I don't know if that responds well enough to the question.
Well, the thing is, after the trials, because I know our time is getting to an hour, but just to fill in this third phase of the story after the
Yeah,
trials,
I think you should.
Yeah, please do.
we have the creation of the Green Mountain Boys. We have Allen creating the Onion River Land Company and coordinating with Skene and William Gilliland, the founder of Willsboro, New York, and Jehiel Hawley, a military man from down in the Arlington area. These men get together and they decide that they're going to revise or to rejuvenate Skene's 1759 colony proposal and break away from New York and create this huge colony from the Connecticut River to the west. And so Skene ends up going to England and conferring with Dartmouth, and he ends up getting appointed lieutenant governor of Crown Point and Fort Ticonderoga in anticipation of creating, if not a colony, at least a very large area that's going to be under his control, both militarily and civilly.
And the courts.
And Gilliland was also a justice of the peace. So, I mean, these men had all of the different avenues on how they were going to run a colony put together. And right after Skene was appointed in January of 1775, when he's on his way back to the colonies, that's when
Allen
and Lexington break out, and he ends up his ship ends up in Philadelphia. He's taken into custody by the Continental Congress, goes back to England, is allowed to go back to England, associates with Burgoyne, comes back to the Champlain Valley and participates with Burgoyne as his the man and head of supplies and administering oaths to loyalists. And then he gets captured again in Saratoga.
One of the things that we can't prove, but I would wager a lot of money on it if we could prove it, is when Skene was captured in Philadelphia, the leaders of the Continental Congress knew about Skene. They knew what he was doing, and they had the information. They had spies in England. Skene had access to the king. Stop that. Skene had access to the king through Dartmouth. Dartmouth was the half-brother of Lord North, and Lord North was his prime minister. And so Allen and the Green and they captured Ticonderoga on May 10, 1775. At the same time, Herrick and his troops of vandalized Skene's home, taken his dead wife out of her coffin, stole her jewelry, took all the lead lining and made musket balls with it. And they go to Philadelphia, Allen and Warner. They're outlaws in New York, but they went there anyway through New York. At the same time, they go and talk to the Continental Congress on the 23rd of June and get the Congress's support for the Green Mountain Regiment that Ethan thought he'd run, but Allen was elected. Skene is on parole there. Is there any chance that the two of them didn't see each other? And then when Skene is, he's sent to Hartford because he's under, captivity. And in the December of 1776, he is exchanged. And he gets to the Hudson and comes down the Hudson. I'll be there in a minute. He comes down the Hudson. And who else is in New York City at that time? Well, Ethan's still under captivity, but he's come from Portsmouth, England to Ireland, to Nova Scotia, to South Carolina, and to New York. And he's in New York with his continental buddies when Washington wins at Trenton and Princeton. And they celebrate with, you know what they celebrate with, a flowing bowl. And at the same time, in his journals of the captivity of Ethan Allen, he writes about a meeting that he was asked to come to by a very high up British officer who knew Clinton and who also had access to the king. And we looked for anybody else that was in New York at the time that could have really matched those things, and it's not. He wouldn't use Skene's name because by now Skene was the arch Tory. And Allen wanted to get his reputation buffered a little before he went back to Vermont. So they met there,
Yeah.
we think.
It's interesting. I think we think of everything as very far apart, but it really was a small world in some very real ways. So that we are at time. And in fact, one of the comments that came through while you were discussing at the moment you started discussing the Earl of Dartmouth was a question about the Earl of Dartmouth, and I believe you answered it. So that was a perfect coincidence there. We could talk for so much longer, but I'm going to encourage everyone who's following along to purchase the book, Rebel and Tory. We will be having Nick and Gary back in the fall as part of our third Thursday series to do a full presentation of the narrative of the book itself. We just wanted to give you all a taste and to meet the authors and give them a taste of the extraordinary amount of research that they put into this work and the new things that they discovered while they were doing so. So make sure you get your own copy of the book. Nick and Gary, I believe both will be making other potentially virtual appearances over the coming months, and we'll make sure we share those on the Vermont Historical Society's page and keep you up to date on them so you can learn even more. And again, we will be having them join us again this fall. Thank you so much, Nick and Gary. I'm thrilled we were able to do this work today.
It sure shows you what kind of research you can do with a digital camera.
Thank you for having us.
Thank you. Well,
Pleasure to be here.
I hope you both enjoy this beautiful day and everyone watching along at home as well. Thank you.
Thank you.
You know, that call that kept interrupting me was probably information that I just won the New York lottery.
Well, you'll have to call him back for sure then. Good luck.
Right.
Goodbye.
Bye.
Thank you. See you, Gary.
So long, Nick.
You do good. You should have been more of you.
No.
All right, I will close out the meeting today.
Okay.